pop it out there. There we go.
I'm not going to stand in, as if you saw me present, I don't stand in one place very well, so I will use it. But thanks for having me. How many people, this is your first time in Cooperstown? Oh, a few first timers, all right. Have you been to the hall yet, or today will be your first one?
Today.
Awesome. You will enjoy. It's a wonderful place. I grew up not too far from, well, the Kingston group. I grew up sort of in that general area. So I've been here many, many, many times. It's always fun to come back. So thank you, Gary, for asking me. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is the integration of the Negro League stats into Major League Baseball stats. Not something that most people have really talked about. It happened and it just kind of has sat there. And so what I wanted to do is to tell you a little bit about how that happened, what some of the issues were, how it, and what they continue to work with, et cetera, et cetera. And so and the reason that I get to talk about this in part is because Phil Dixon and I were both part of the Major League Baseball's committee that helped to make this possible. And so we were part of a 16-person committee that looked at all of these issues. So a little bit, I'm a historian, so you got to talk a little bit about how this came to be. So the Negro Leagues, of course, I'm assuming everybody knows, officially lasted from 1920 to, well, end date, there's a little bit of debate, but I always say 1960. Why do I say 1960? Because that's really the last time you actually have a league with multiple teams still playing. And so, we had over 40 years of statistics there. And so, where this all really got its start is Major League Baseball has looked at the issue of statistics a number of times over the years. And most recently, they had a committee that met in 1969 to determine at that point who and which leagues that have existed historically were going to be given major league status, right? And at that time, they gave the Federal League and a number of other leagues that status. There was no discussion at all of including the Negro Leagues. It wasn't even mentioned at the meeting, and so they never even considered that possibility in 1969. And if you think about American history, that's not a big surprise that they weren't thinking about that in 1969. So that was the last time that this was looked at until 2020. Now in between that, obviously conversations had grown, there was discussions, but no real significant action until 2020, when 7 of the Negro Leagues, hence the reason sometimes people will say Negro League, there were multiple Negro Leagues, and 7 of those were granted Major League status. The actual announcement made it say they were elevating the Negro Leagues. I would say they did not need to be elevated, they already had that status. But they were granted Major League Baseball status, and I'll show you which leagues those are in a minute. A lot of that grew out of work that had started back long before this with the creation of the Negro Leagues Museum back in the 90s, but really with the effort made to bring in the 17 Negro Leaguers who were elected to the Hall of Fame in 2006. The information, the stats that were gathered for that came out of a grant that was given to a committee of which I was a part as well. And so that's kind of what started the realization that there had been more stats gathered than most people realized, okay? So in 2020, those 7 leagues were granted. And of course that immediately raised the question then, okay, what does that actually mean? So you gave them the status, and the logical question that people ask, well, what happens to the statistics then, right? And so that was an interesting question that there was no answer for at the time, until 2024, so it took 4 years for them to make the decision to include the records of just over 2,300 Negro League players. The initial announcements that people were talking about, I heard numbers being thrown out, this is going to put 4,500 people, et cetera, et cetera. That was not the case. The number is 2,300 plus, simply because of which leagues were chosen to be put into Major League status. And so that inclusion rested on the research that's been done for decades, literally decades at this point. Anybody ever read, besides Phil, because I know he has read the book, Only the Ball Was White? Came out in 1970, and that really was the jump start of, so if you think about it, that's 55 years of people doing significant research on the Negro Leagues, so this is not new. And so resting on that research that's been done for decades by a whole variety of individuals, that has led to date, 37 Negro Leaguers being elected to the Hall of Fame, that largest group in 2006, our most recent 2 years ago, with Bud Fowler and Buck O'Neill completing that group, because the most recent one did not have anyone elected from the Negro Leagues. That committee elected Dave Parker and Dick Allen this time around. So lots of work still to be done on that particular issue, but we'll leave that for a conversation for another day. And so these are the 7 Negro Leagues that were granted that status, starting with the Negro National League, which lasted from 1920 to 1931. The Eastern Colored League, which was the counterpart to the Negro National League, started in 1923. With the creation of the Eastern Colored League and the Negro National League, you have the opportunity for that first World Series and things that started. The American Negro League for that one season in 1929, the East-West League in 1932. The Negro Southern League is the most interesting one because they were granted that status for 1932, but the Negro Southern League was also actually established in 1920, and it lasted longer than any of the other leagues. That's the only year, and I'll talk about why. That was the only year that it was granted Negro League status by Major League Baseball. And then the Negro American League from 37 to 48, and the second version of the Negro National League from 33 to 48. And so 48 is the ending, even though the Negro Leagues continued on. And there's been some argument and some discussion about the potential of 49 and 50 being added to that. I don't know how much traction it's going to get, but there has certainly been some discussion. All of this was based on a number of factors. What they were looking at was the level of competition in terms of who these teams were playing against, the status of and stats of the players on the teams, and so some of that had to do with how many Hall of Famers were on some of these teams, that kind of thing. And so the Negro Southern League is the unique one, and it qualified in 32 simply because, as you'll see, most of the other leagues were gone. Great Depression. And so the Negro Southern League rose to a status it did not normally have. For a lot of the time that the Negro Southern League was in existence, it wasn't officially considered this, but a lot of them thought that the Negro Southern League really served more as a minor league system. And so for a lot of the players, the idea was, if you played in the Negro Southern League, what you really wanted to do was to get promoted up to the Kansas City Monarchs, the Homestead Grays, etc. So that's the reason for just the 1 year for the Negro Southern League. Okay? So thinking about what all of this means, one of the key people involved, of course, was Larry Lessner, who is the premier expert on all of this. And he said, stories, folklore, and embellished truths have long been a staple of the Negro League's narrative. You know that, well, Josh Gibson hit the longest home run out of Yankee Stadium, hit 4 home runs in another stadium, Satchel Paige used to pitch. All of these stories, right, those storylines will always be entertaining, but now our dialogues can be quantified and qualified to support the authentic greatness of these athletes. What stands behind that statement, of course, is the statistics that have been gathered, and what most people don't realize is just how extensive those stats are. On some of the teams, there's up to almost 90% of the material. In most cases, it's about 85%. Before everybody says, well, that's not 100%. Well, if you follow Major League Baseball stats and the history of Major League Baseball stats, those change too, as they had to, and they have changed over the years. And so these will continue to change as well as more and more details get filled in. So that shouldn't be, even though that is one of the things lots of people said, it's really not a valid criticism. John Horn, who is Major League Baseball's historian and has been that official historian for 15 years, he led the committee on all of this. Shortened Negro League schedules, interspersed with revenue-raising exhibition games, were born of Major League Baseball's exclusionary practices. To deny the best black players of the era their rightful place among all-time leaders would be a double penalty, right? So basically saying, it's not their fault that they didn't have the stats that match up with Major League Baseball. So to deny them that is really not fair because it wasn't theirs. So just thinking about those kind of things. The issue when all this came to fruition, lots and lots of people had reactions, of course. Many positive, but also lots and lots of criticism. Lots of people who were not happy with what was being suggested and what was being done here. And for a variety of reasons. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about, are some of those issues and concerns, and sort of lay out why people have thought different ways about this. The first one, as I just mentioned, was the lack of complete stats. How can you put these players in when we don't have all of their statistics? You can't compare. And as I just said, well, that's not actually an accurate statement to make. Yes, there are missing statistics, but that's always true. And that hasn't stopped any other league from being included. Think about all the leagues going back to the 19th century that have been granted Major League Baseball status, and those things change all the time. And so I don't see that one as a very legitimate concern. All it just means is, as we find more, those numbers will change again, right? And it's encouragement, actually, for people to try to fill in those gaps, now that they know what those gaps are, as opposed to previously, and I see people didn't even know what those gaps were, what existed and what didn't exist. Another concern, and this one a much more legit one, and when we had spent a lot of time talking about the shorter schedules, certainly that the Negro Leagues played. And you might immediately think, wait, I thought they played 200 plus games a year. They did. But the vast majority of those were not league games. And that leads to a variety of other questions. Most Negro League teams played league games somewhere between 60 and 80 a season, depending on the season, depending on the teams. And the other 120, 140 plus are all exhibition and barnstorming games, right? And so those do not count in their statistics because those are not official games, just like for Major League teams when they play, right? Those don't count. And so those are not included in the official statistics for Major League Baseball. They are included in other places. You can go to CMEDS and see all of those statistics if you want to. But that idea of shortened schedule, you still got the question then, well, they're only playing 60 or 80 games. Major League Baseball players play a lot more than that, right? So how can we compare? Well, let's see. We've got a strike-shortened season for Major League Baseball that matches up with one of these that is in there. You've got earlier seasons, right? There's a variety of different numbers that are there. So, and again, not their fault. And so it sort of puts an idea. The problem with the shortened seasons and figuring this out, it wasn't really so much the short season, it was this. So let's say the Kansas City Monarchs and the Homestead Braves are playing a game. And they're playing in Kansas City on a Monday night. And then on Tuesday they play again. Turns out sometimes that only one of those games, even though it's the same teams, right, was a league game, the other was an exhibition game. So figuring out which of those games counts tells you, of course, again, contrary to what some people think, there were actual schedules for the Negro Leagues, and so you could figure out which were league games and which were not. But for a lot of people looking at it, they're like, well, it's the same teams playing. But those don't count because they're not, right? The level of competition has always been a question, right? Particularly, but really, it's only a question when you talk about some of the barnstorming games where there is less knowledge about who some of those players are. If you've granted Major League status to these teams, then you've already acknowledged the level of competition, haven't you? Right? Because that was one of the criteria. And so the notion of level of competition as an issue goes away when you think about that for those leagues that have been granted that status. But that's still been one of the issues that's out there. And then as I mentioned, the league versus non-league games, again, they don't count, so you don't have to worry about those particular issues. And so these, among other things. And then there was a lot of discussion in our meetings about, how do we make sure that we're answering the questions that people might be asking. And to some degree, I think that was probably why I was there. Because I'm not a big stats person necessarily. I don't do the big stats I leave that to other people. And so how do we explain this and make sure that to some degree, I think maybe Phil and I, that's where you and I both came into play a little bit, because we had that discussion about necessarily thinking about. And so in addition to all of the stats, if you go on Major League Baseball's website for all of it, they have a frequently asked questions and discuss some of these things. How do you understand what the Negro Leagues are, how they play? Because one of the questions some people who don't know anything about the Negro Leagues always ask is, did they play on the same size fields? Did they play with the same equipment? Oh yeah, we get that. And the answer is, of course they did, right? And so therefore, but some people don't know that. And so in some ways, this gave an opportunity to maybe address that with a much larger audience than we normally get, to talk about what the Negro Leagues were. One of the other, of course, major concerns that was also raised by many and has continued to be raised, and I think is a somewhat legitimate concern, and that is, if we put all of these stats in with Major League Baseball, does that run the risk that someday people will forget that the Negro Leagues existed as a separate entity and why they existed as a separate entity? And to some degree, I think that is a potentially legit concern, but my answer to that is very simple. That then makes our job even more important to tell the stories behind those statistics. As you do with anybody's story, right? Numbers only do so much. And that's true with any of the ball players in there. So in actuality, in my view, it opens it up for so much more discussion about these ball players that nobody ever heard of before in many cases, right? People are familiar with Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and others, but there are, as you saw, a couple thousand ball players that are now having the opportunity for people to know who they are, which never would have happened before. And so, again, in my view, that is a concern. But I just think that makes our jobs like mine to come out here and tell these stories even more important, right? And so what happened as a result when all of this changed? And some of you may be very familiar with some of the immediate stories that came out and people jumping up and down about how dare this happen. But I'll just show you a few examples. So for the highest single season batting average, that now belongs to Josh Gibson in 1943 when he hit .466, okay, with the Homestead Grays. The second there is Chino Smith. A name, I would argue, anybody in industry know much, again, aside from Phil, know anything about Chino Smith. Yeah, so here's a guy who's gonna get that chance, because people are looking at it and saying, wait, this guy hit .451, who is he? All right, why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? Well, the first problem for Chino Smith is under the regular rules, you had to have 10 years of, he never quite made it to that 10 years. And so he has a shortened career, unfortunately. But he hit .451 in 1929 for the Lincoln Giants. The previous record had been held by Hugh Duffy in 1894. So it's not even a 20th century, so some of the people who were upset, they didn't even know who Hugh Duffy was. And so this one didn't nearly get as much reaction as some of the other changes that are going to take place. This is an example in slugging percentage. So Barry Bonds in 2001, 863. Well, again, our friend Josh Gibson, 974 in 1937. Mule Suttles, my favorite player, 877 in 1926. Gibson again, 871 in 1943. And our friend Chino Smith, back there for that same season in 1929. All right? And so Barry Bonds' 863 has been surpassed by all of these players for a single season record, right? Thank you. And it's wonderful. And the opportunity to now just get to know these players. Once again, so how many, I'm guessing, just by a show of hands, everybody, how many people have heard of Josh Gibson? Right, okay. How many people have heard of Mule Suttles? Right, okay. And Mule Suttles, of course, is in the Hall of Fame. And so he's not even a minor player in the large scheme of things, but opportunities for these players to be known. Suttles was an outfielder, first baseman for the Newark Eagles, Ethel Manley's team. Batting average was Ty Cobb's. It's now Josh Gibson at .372. And of course, as you can imagine, it was was this kind of record that got everybody who were opposed to this or worried about it, etc. They said, wait a second, how can that be? It's Ty Cobb, you can't do that. Records are not sacrosanct, they are just numbers, right? And to me, it's the stories that are behind it, and that's the average he earned, and you've given him major league status, then that's what he deserves to have. You can't have it both ways. You can't give them major league status and then say, oh, but you don't get these other things that come along with it, right? And it just doesn't work that way. And so, again, just a couple of examples. Josh Gibson's career OPS is now first. Satchel Paige, single season ERA is third. Buck Leonard, career OPS is fifth. And Oscar Charleston, career average is now third. And again, everybody's heard the name Satchel Paige, right? How about Buck Leonard? A few more, okay. And Oscar Charleston? Okay, a few more again. With Oscar Charleston, some people have argued over the years that if you're looking at all of his stats and everything, that he's right up there with the best players, and some have argued he might be one of the best players ever, right up there with Ruth and others that we talk about. Charleston had a very, very long career, player, manager, mentored lots and lots of ball players along the way, and now getting some of that recognition. But the thing here with all of these guys, they're already in the Hall of Fame, so they've received some recognition, so people are aware, but now their stats are there as well, instead of just the simple stories behind them. Some of our other Hall of Famers, okay? So Willie Mays, of course, because he started and did play in the Negro Leagues in 1948, had 10 additional hits added when he was in Birmingham, so it took his hits, as you can see, from 3283 to 3293. He's still 12th on the hit list. The 10 hits didn't change his position. It added 4 walks, a triple, 2 doubles, and 6 RBIs. So what was already an impressive record now includes at least his 1948. For Larry Doby, playing with the Indians, now Guardians at the time, 141 games for the Newark Eagles between 1942 and 47. So his changed significantly. We got 182 hits, 20 homers, and 123 RBIs. And so you can now see his overall totals. And Doby, of course, first to integrate the American League side, right? And we often sort of forget the seconds and the thirds and the fourths. And so he doesn't nearly get as much attention as Jackie Robinson does. Robinson himself, 49 hits added to his, and his average went from 311 to 313. So you can see for Page, his career wins went from 28 to 125, with 7 complete games up to 94, and 476 innings pitched to 1,725. So obviously it made the biggest difference for Page, just simply because, as we all know, the number of games Page pitched while he was playing. And of course, given his age when he came into Major League Baseball, right, his career was fairly short on that end of things. But people will still look at this number in particular and say, well, that doesn't represent what Satchel did. Well, this would be one of those examples of, to some degree, exaggeration by Satchel. But also barnstorming exhibition games, because he did more of that during the time than most other players. Because remember, one of the things a lot of people don't realize about Satchel is he tended to not be the pitcher who necessarily pitched complete games all the time, because he was often on the move. And so he might pitch 3 innings for one team and then go to another and pitch 3 innings. Right? Because one of the interesting things about Satchel was if he was going to be at a game, it guaranteed your attendance was going to go up. And so he was essentially used by all the teams pretty much. I don't know, Phil, maybe I don't think there's a Negro League team that he probably didn't pitch for at least once during the course of his career, simply because of that particular idea. And then the others who, and I didn't put all their numbers up there, but the others who would have been affected by this were Don Newcomb, Minnie Minoso, Monty Irvin, and Roy Campanella, who all had opportunities to play and were there in 48. One of the reasons some people have made the argument for 49 and 50 is because that would affect people like Hank Aaron and a couple of others who came along a little bit later, and would add to their statistics as well. Don't know, but that could be a change that may happen at some point. So you end up with these just a few examples of some of our Negro leaguers. Cool Papa Bell, certainly his stats are down there, and everybody recognizes him, right? Primarily for what? What was Cool Papa?
Speed.
His speed.
You could turn out the lights and be in bed before it got dark.
Right, which is one of my favorite stories. Talk about a story that is embellished and yet actually true. It is actually true, because here was so Satchel Paige loved to play jokes on people, right? Satchel Paige loved to tell stories. And so finally some of his teammates decided they were going to tell a story back and sort of pay Satchel back for some of his. And so they told Satchel that Cool Papa Bell could flip off the light switch and get across the room under the covers before the lights went out. Paige said, of course, that can't happen. Nobody's fast enough to do that. So they took him up to the room, and sure enough, Bell presses one, chops the pad, and the lights go out. You remember the old light switches where you had to push it in? It had a short in it. And so that is the reason it is actually technically a true story.
I did not know that.
Yes. And so Paige, they sort of had their fun with Paige, just the way he had with other people. But that's so that's, those stories aren't going away. That's what makes the stats just tell you, wow, we want to know more about that guy, right? And stats allow us in baseball to compare everybody. We love to do that, right? But half the time, even when you're trying to comparing apples and oranges, how do you compare Babe Ruth seasons to, Juan Soto's today or whoever you fill in the blank? And so the Negro leaguers fit in that same category. But the other three up here, I would argue probably most people don't know who they are. So Judd Wilson has a season average where he hit 350. Anybody know anything about Judd Boojum Wilson? Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah.
Is that actually Judy Wilson?
No.
No. A different player by the name?
You're talking about Judy Johnson.
Oh, you are correct. All right.
And so that's Judy Johnson. Right?
Okay.
This is Judd Wilson.
Never.
And Judd Wilson, of course, was a phenomenal player with a temper to match. And that was usually what got him in a little bit of trouble. But boy, could he hit. And then you have down in the corner here, Biz Mackey, 328, 3,081 at bats. Again, anybody know anything about Biz Mackey? And now you have the chance, because his stats are in there, considered to be probably the closest competition Josh Gibson had to one of the best catchers in the Negro Leagues, and out of Texas. Phenomenal player. That's him playing there with the Hillsdale Daisies. And then up in the far corner is Tatello Vargas in 1943 at 471 for the New York Cubans. One of our Latin American players, right? Because a lot of people don't realize the connections between the Negro Leagues and Latin America, with our Negro League players going down to Latin America to play, and Latin American players coming up and playing in the Negro Leagues. And so Tatello Vargas is a good example, and there's many of those. And so, to me, this is where the importance of all of this comes in, is because it highlights these stories that most people have never heard of, they know nothing about. And suddenly they're going to get that chance to see what these guys are capable of doing. I don't expect you to be able to read this, so you can all, because I can't even read it. It's illustrated, and I've got a few of these, because you never know places where you go with internet and things like that. So this is Judd Wilson's record now that you can look up, okay? And it starts in 1922 and goes all the way to 1943 here at the bottom. But the fascinating thing, so this is all of his stats. One of the things that they have done is they've put a category that never used to exist right here that says leveled. And it tells you non, major, right? Non. So you can flip back and forth on his stats to see just his major league stats. You can see all of them. You can see which seasons he was on a team that was considered major league, so that if you want to do comparisons. But think about that, just that simple addition of that category. When people see that, it raises an immediate question that's going to make them go, what does that mean? So the fear that I mentioned earlier, that the Negro Leagues and all of that is going to disappear, well, not with something like that, right? Because and people are going to look at that and go, I don't know what the ECL is. Never heard of it. I know the American League, I know the National League, what is that? And of course that's the Eastern Colored League. And so he's got the Eastern Colored League on here, he's got the American Negro League, he's got the East-West League, and then the Negro National League, the second one, all the way down. And so this is what you were able to take a look at now in some of these records. And so this is Judd Wilson's, okay? A few other examples. So here on the far side, a gentleman by the name of Eugene Bremer. There were a few Ohioans in the audience earlier. Eugene played for the Cleveland Buckeyes as his most prominent team, pitcher. He was on the World Series winning Cleveland Buckeyes in 1945. And when they won that World Series, it's probably one of the biggest on paper upsets that had ever happened. They were playing the Homestead Grays. Homestead Grays had 5 future Hall of Famers on their team. On paper, they were the clear winner expected, right? We all see that to win that World Series. You can probably guess who won that World Series. That would be the Cleveland Buckeyes, but it gets better than that. 4-0, and 2 of those games were shutouts. And so the Cleveland Buckeyes, and nobody seems, but now, because of players like this, one of the urgings that, for example, we have given to the Cleveland Guardians and other teams is, now that you recognize their status, now that you recognize their stats, how about you hang their winning banners alongside all the others when they've won a World Series? And that is slowly happening with a few of the teams. Cleveland is not one of them yet. Not a big surprise on that particular front, but we're working on it. But that's a story that people will now know about Gene Bremer simply because his name is there. John Newell Miles is guy in the center there, out of Texas. Miles was a big, lanky first baseman who played mostly for the Chicago American Giants, a number of other teams. Not a superstar, but a solid player, right? And he now has his story. And what most people don't know about John Miles is that many people consider him to be a little bit equivalent in his knowledge, his personality, etc., to the gentleman on the far side, Buck O'Neil. But of course, John Newell Miles died very early and never had an opportunity to enjoy a much longer life and all of the recognition that some of the Negro League players got in later life. Buck O'Neil, of course, everybody knows Buck O'Neil. But prior to Ken Burns using Buck O'Neil as the narrator for his series, I would argue, did any of you know who he was? That's what brought Buck O'Neil to everyone's awareness. And then obviously Buck O'Neil, one of the founders of the Negro League Museum, greatest advocate for the other Negro League players. But most of the time, that's all anybody ever talked about. They never really talked about what he did as a player, what his record looked like. They talk a little bit more about him as a manager because that sort of fit with some of his later things that he did in life. But as a player, Buck was an all-star. Buck hit over 300 for his career. I mean, he was an incredible ball player. That's part of his story is now able to be told as well, right? The integration of these statistics. And so this is Eugene Bremer's record, and again, the same kind of thing. You'll see the level of his play. So his goes from 1936 through 1948, okay? But with Bremer, they include his pitching and his batting record, and you might be surprised to see that, or not, Negro League pitchers always hit, and many of them played, many of them actually played when they're not pitching in the outfield, things like that, partly because Negro League teams just didn't have the numbers that Major League teams had, typically 14 to 16 players on a team. But you'll notice it now lists his Major League seasons as 11 and his black baseball season as one, because there was 1 year where he wasn't on a major league team under the new stats. But again, you can flip-flop back and see the differences in those stats. This is John Miles. His is short, as I told you, 46 to 48. So there's only, and then played in Mexico in 1952. So he has 3 major league seasons, 1 minor league season, so 4 seasons total. But again, prior to this, only those of us who really studied knew who he was. And now everybody has a chance to know who he is, right? And of course, this is Buck O'Neill's from 1937 to 1948, playing almost, and all of his are major league, because he's with the Kansas City Monarchs for that entire time. And you can see, for all levels of the 10 seasons, his overall batting average was 256, but he had a number of seasons where he hit over 300. Okay? This is all now available to everybody. A couple of other examples. So, Cristobal Torriente. Anybody know his name? Hall of Famer, elected in 2006 as part of that group. In 1920, this is an example, outfield for the Chicago American Giants, 393. He led the original Negro National League in average and RBIs in its inaugural season. So, and he was one of our Latin American players who came up to play. Mentioned Oscar Charleston to you before. So here's Oscar Charleston in 21 with the St. Louis Giants. The winner of the Negro National League's first batting triple crown, had the highest average in OBP in the majors in 1921, trailed only Babe Ruth in slugging and OPS. Honorable mention for the season goes to Charleston's giant teammate, Charlie Blackwell, who hit .432 with an OPS of 1.218. So the only comparison that Charleston had at the time was Babe Ruth. And this is why some people put Charleston at the top of the heap in terms of one of the best players to ever play the game. And so those are the first 2 seasons of the Negro National League. We now can know that Bullet Rogan, outfielder and pitcher for the Kansas City Monarchs. Notice his hitting. So you were 370, but he's mostly known as a pitcher. But he hit 370. He had 15 home runs. Also stole 16 bases. And a best historical comparison for Shohei Ohtani's two-way prowess isn't Ruth. It may actually be Rogan, who manned the outfield on his days off. This wasn't even Rogan's best season on the mound. He had 2 separate sub 2.0 ER seasons, but his 15 home runs were a career high, and making this one of his best overall performances. Another Hall of Famer. Okay? But now we can start to fill in all of these individual season details as well. Heaphy Johnson, again, probably a name, anybody recognize it? Playing for the Kansas City Monarchs in 23, 99 games, the highest season that we had. Onslaught of extra base hits also included 32 doubles, 13 triples. He won the Negro National League Triple Crown, 2nd consecutive batting title. And now people can know the story. So this is the kind of thing that those who love stats, this makes them very happy to see those things. And so that's really what has happened, and that is the story. And for me, when people have asked me, as you heard me say earlier, I'm not a big stats person, they're great, but for me, they only tell part of the story. What is important in all of this, in my view, is the recognition that it is given to the ball players and their families. Because we all know that it is the family as well, and every major ball player, right, their family loves to be able to talk about the family and say, that's my dad in there, that's my grandpa, Negro League players have never been able to do that. And when this happened, one of the biggest stories that most people missed was talking to the Negro League families who were so incredibly grateful that this had finally, because most people say, well, these guys are all dead, what difference does it make? It was about doing what was right, but also gives recognition to their families and the opportunity for them to say, they did something, and it's now being recognized instead of continuing to always be seen as something secondary, lesser than, etc. And so, is the work done? No. Absolutely not. Is the work continuing? Absolutely. Will there be more changes? Yes. Are there going to be sometimes corrections and fixes? Sure. Same thing that has happened with all Major League Baseball stats. That work will continue, is continuing. Like I said, whether we'll see more seasons, what I think is much more likely than seasons being added at 49 and 50 is I think we may see more leagues being added to this in some of those years where there were multiple leagues playing, and that would certainly add more players. And so wait and see what happens on that particular score. But that's a little bit of an overview, and I am happy to take any questions that anybody has, and I can try to give you a good answer. Or as I tell my students, I'll make up something good. You can't record that, Gary. Yes, sir.
I have a question for you. So you mentioned that game, which was a league game versus an exhibition.
Yes.
Game.
Mm-hmm.
If they're the same teams, the same location, why was one a league game? Why was one an exhibition? Is there any
Great question. Yeah. So for the most, probably for the reasons one might think of, had to do with the economics of it. If it's being played as a league game, right, then the league takes a percentage cut of what's happening, things like that. If it was played as an exhibition game, that's just between the two teams and whoever stadium they're using, and there's no other entity involved in all of that. And so that was often the case. And so that's the primary reason that, but it's a great question. And then the other oddity is, a lot of the games were filler. So that's one example, but the much more common was, so we're playing in Chicago on Monday night, and our next games are Friday in New York City. Well, we've got a lot of places that we're going to pass through on their way, and it's the same teams traveling together, so they might stop in Canton, Ohio, they might stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, right, and play one another just to make money between those games. And so that's where a lot of the additional games come from, is when they are traveling. Sure. And you'll hear a lot more about the conditions of that travel tonight from Phil, because that's what he's going to talk about. Yeah.
So, as you framed it earlier, you had mentioned how you have all these extra stats.
Yeah.
How you enjoyed your role of kind of giving a story and a narrative to those stats. So far, since those inclusions into the Major League records, have you seen any uptick in other parties maybe retelling or maybe taking a different angle and approach to telling a story of those players, due to the fact that if somebody is going to compare, was it Charleston?
Yeah.
To Babe Ruth, there's that existing that if you're not comparing two people in a same major league, that is going to influence that narrative. But
sure.
If you've got two people in a major league, or each in a major league, then that discussion becomes different, that story becomes different.
It does and it doesn't, and so it's a great question, and I have a variety of answers floating in my head. But the first one is, it raises a question or a thought that I didn't mention earlier, and that is, so Ruth is in one league, Charleston is in another. So one of the complaints people had is that these guys never played one another. And the simple answer to that one is, well, up until very, very recently, American League teams never played National League teams, right? So, I'm sorry, that's not a legit, that doesn't matter. It doesn't come into play. So, but I think where the change has come is not so much in maybe changing that narrative. Where I think the change has come and where we've seen it is particularly small towns who suddenly discover that they have a major leaguer in their history, have taken it upon themselves to learn that story, to start to tell that story, and usually those are players nobody has ever heard of. And some of those towns nobody has ever heard of. And Phil's the expert on that because that's one of his, he goes out and goes to all these small towns. I think he's been to every small town in Missouri and Kansas to tell those stories from this. And so we've seen a lot more of that. And so that's really where we've seen a change. There have been some, like the Bullet Rogan, Shohei Ohtani, there's been more discussion of him as a potential earlier version of that two-way player than there were previously. And people have said similar things. Well, you're comparing, and I say, but that's what you always do when you're using stats in Major League Baseball, right? By comparing Babe Ruth to somebody of today, Barry Bonds, isn't that what you're doing? So how is this any different? And so, slowly I think we may see more of that, but so far, what I have seen is more of the, let's tell the story of because we now have a major leaguer in our history, and every town wants to be able to tout something that gives them a little recognition.
Yeah, about a year ago, I read a wonderful book called Our Team about the 1948 Indians, and I learned that Bill Beck was a proponent of all things Negro baseball player. Were there any other owners, either good or bad, who would fit into a narrative about
Wanting to
Negro?
see, so as individuals, a number of them did.
Okay.
Unfortunately, they acted as a collective whole, and of course from 20 onward, they had kind of saw Mountain Landis to deal with. And Landis was very much, Landis is the one who literally issued it that major league teams couldn't play major league teams as full teams. So that kind of put it, but if you look back at Don Montgomery Ward, Connie Mack, some of the earlier, many of them said more than once, if such and such a player had been white, I would happily have him on my team, but I can't, right, because of the existing. And so the idea that one owner could come up against, right, and Landis had a lot of power. The owners gave it to him, and he used it, and this was, now, that being said, we also know that Negro League teams did play mixed all-star teams from the major leagues. They just couldn't play the Detroit Tigers, right? But they played Dizzy Dean's All-Stars, they played Bob Feller's All-Stars, and won regularly. So if you have questions about the level of competition, it's pretty easy to answer that way as well. Anybody else with questions? Happy to take them if you've got them. Yeah.
So pitcher double duty, is he in the major league stats?
Yes, he does have, because part of his career puts him on a few of those teams. There's not a lot, because he tended to play in the Negro Southern, he played a lot of seasons in the Negro Southern League. But yeah, he's included now. Along with his brother Alec, of course, gets more in because his brother Alec played for more major league teams than double duty did. But yeah, so double duty pitcher and catcher, he was the one who would typically pitch one game and catch the second game of a doubleheader. But yeah, he's there.
Right.
Yep. Yes, sir.
So knowing stats a little bit, I would look at this logically as far as shortened season versus a major league season.
Sure.
However, how has that come across when it comes to record holders? Because we know the Hall of Fame, Cooperstown, is not loaned, they are associated with Major League Baseball.
Right, they are their own private
Their own
entity.
entity. So how has that gone over with Major League Baseball as far as how they viewed the record holders? Because now you're replacing.
Okay, well, remember, this was done by Major League Baseball, and this is a committee of Major League Baseball. That we were sitting in the room with Pat Courtney and others. This is all Major League Baseball is doing, and so in this one instance, for good or for ill, you can question them and talk about their motives and all those kind of things. Doesn't matter. They took the lead on this particular idea, and so this is Major League Baseball, and they knew, and that was part of our discussions, that this was going to cause people to lose their minds over some of the records, the big ones that had been there forever and people think are sacrosanct. But that was Major League Baseball, which is why they wanted to spend some time on this, why they wanted to talk through how do we answer some of those questions. That was part of the reason they put together that frequently asked questions for people so that they'd have a little better understanding of where this came from and why. And so, yeah, in this particular case, Major League Baseball took the lead. Yeah.
Does your committee continue to exist? Because I know from talking to Phil, people are finding old newspapers in attics and pouring on stuff that are, who's doing the sorting and figuring out moving forward?
So the committee, that 16-person committee with our regular meetings, technically is not ongoing, though members of it are the same ones who were before, Larry Lester, and others who have been working on the stats, continue to work with CMEDS, and CMEDS, which is the really, if you really want to see the true Negro League stats, all of them, that's where you go. They continue to work with Baseball Reference, so if people are, they're generally submitting to the same people they did before, and it's making its way through that same circle. The only time I think they bring us back in is if they were to add more leagues or do something pretty significant, so that we talk through the same kinds of questions and make sure that we were doing the right things, and had thought about all the questions people, at least as many as we could think of, that people might ask. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I learned maybe 20, 25 years ago that sacrifice flies, which today are not considered that bad, they were not bad back in 1941, because I read that Ted Williams in 41 had like 8 or 10, and if those had been, if that's been taken out, he would have hit like 410, 415. Is there any way to learn when those rules changed, either for MLB or for the Negro
So
Leagues?
whenever any of those rules changed, we would be doing the same thing for the Negro League stats that they've done to Major League stats.
Okay.
So whatever the rules were at the time, the same things are being applied because they played the same way. And so we just, to be fair, you have to, the problem, the biggest problem, but it's not unique to Negro League stats. It's also true for Major League Baseball, minor league baseball, et cetera, is there was a time period, right? When you go back and look at box scores, you guys have done it, they don't include everything. And they didn't. And they didn't, and so one of the difficulties in the Negro League stats, because they tend to sometimes even be less. And one of the big ones, and so what you won't find in a lot of the records if you go in and look, you'll immediately discover, for example, that stolen bases are typically, you're looking at and thinking, there's lots of years where it looks like nobody in the Negro Leagues ever stole a base. Not true, of course, but they weren't in the box scores. And so one of the key things to making this work was that every single stat that's in there is backed up by box scores. If it's in a story and there is no box score and they can't find box, then it's not there. Because that's how you can reconcile, right? You have to be able to reconcile the number of at-bats, the hits, all of those, and you can only do that with a box score. So for example, Josh Gibson's supposed 4 home runs when he hit in that game in Zanesville, we never found a box score for that. And so it's a wonderful story. It may be true, but until we find the box score to back it up, because that's the same way that Major League Baseball, and that's a way to make sure, as you know, that you're answering the logical question people are going to ask. So that's what a lot of people thought, that a lot of this is just based on the newspaper stories, and that is not true. And if it doesn't have a box score, then it's not in there yet. Hoping we'll still find some more. All right, thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying this.